I want to tell you about the moment I understood that I was not going to make it. Not dramatically, not with a crisis or a breakdown or a night I'll always remember as the turning point. It was a Tuesday morning in March, a specific Tuesday, the kind you don't mark on a calendar, but that marks itself on you. I was sitting at my kitchen table in Fresno, California, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I was doing math on a piece of paper, the way I'd been doing math on various pieces of paper for about 8 months, and the math was telling me something clear and patient and final. Math is like that. It doesn't raise its voice. It just keeps saying the same thing until you stop arguing with it. What the math was saying was that at the rate I was spending versus what I had coming in, I would exhaust my savings in 4 years and 3 months. I was 62 years old, 4 years, and 3 months from 62 is 66 and change, which is around when Social Security kicks in at the rate you've been told to expect, which sounds like a solution until you do the second part of the math, which is that the full Social Security benefit I qualified for, $1,140 a month at full retirement age, would not cover my rent. My rent was $1,400, which meant that even after the relief of finally reaching full Social Security, I would still be in deficit, still drawing down whatever remained of the savings, still on the same slope I was already on, just at a slightly less catastrophic angle, heading toward the same destination, just arriving a bit later and arriving broke instead of broke and early. The coffee was cold. The paper had numbers on it. The numbers were patient. And I sat in that kitchen in Fresno with the Central Valley traffic building outside the window, and I understood that the life I had been living in California was not going to continue at any acceptable version of itself in California. My name is James Kowalski. I'm 65 now. I'm sitting on the porch of a house I rent in Dalat, Vietnam, in the Central Highlands, where the air comes down from the mountains in the morning smelling like pine trees and coffee blossoms, and sometimes like rain that fell somewhere higher before it reached me, where my rent is $250 a month, where I have a garden that I planted myself and that now grows tomatoes and strawberries and chilies that turned out to be significantly more powerful than I intended, where every single number in my financial life is in the positive territory, and where I have slept with the depth of genuine unconsciousness every night for the past 2.5 years. Let me tell you how I got from that kitchen table to this ruby porch. I need to back up to California because California is not background. California is the whole story, not just the financial version, though the financial version is precise, and I'll give it to you that way because it's what you need, the life version. I grew up in Fresno, middle of the state, in the agricultural heart of the Central Valley, the part of California that the coast doesn't think about unless something goes wrong with the lettuce supply chain or the almond harvest. Fresno is a real city with a real population and a real identity that has nothing to do with the California that ends up in movies, which is fine because most of the California that ends up in movies is a confection and Fresno is a fact. I spent my working life in logistics management for agricultural distributors, which sounds more prestigious than it is. What it actually was, I tracked shipments across a network of suppliers, processors, and retail chains. I managed vendor relationships and cold storage contracts and transport agreements, and the 1,000 daily frictions of getting produce from where it's grown to where it's sold. Temperature compliance, transit time windows, damage claims, driver scheduling, facility coordination across time zones, Unglamorous and essential in equal measure, I did this for 34 years. I rose to senior logistics manager for the last 11. It was the right job for my brain. I like problems that have correct answers if you apply enough precision and enough patience. Logistics is full of those problems. I was good at it. I was very good at it for a very long time. I was divorced from my wife Helen at 51. The divorce was not dramatic. It was the quiet kind, which is sometimes the saddest kind because it arrives without the clarity of a crisis. We had built a life in Northeast Fresno for 18 years, owned a house together, raised our children Michael and Rachel in it, and somewhere in the middle of the second decade of that, we had become two people sharing a structure that had stopped being a shared life. Neither of us wanted to have the conversation because having the conversation meant acknowledging what we both already knew, and for years we didn't have it. And then one morning we had it. It was civil. It was even kind, in the way that long shared history makes people kind to each other even when they're ending something. We sold the house, split the equity, and I moved into an apartment on the north side of Fresno. That apartment, a 2-bedroom place in a development that was fine without being anything more than fine, cost $1,100 a month in 2015. By the time I was doing the math on the kitchen table in 2022, the same apartment I had not moved was costing me $1,400 a month. The market had moved around me while I stayed still. That's what markets do when you're not paying attention, because you're busy working and then busy adjusting to not working and then busy trying to figure out what the next version of the life looks like. The market doesn't care what you're busy with. I retired at 62, not because I wanted to, but because the company restructured and my department was on the wrong side of the restructuring. The announcement was made cheerfully at a company-wide meeting by a man who was around 15 years younger than me and who used the word streamline 4 times in 8 minutes, which I counted because counting things is what I do. My severance was 2 weeks per year of service, which by the standards of corporate severance packages is reasonable, and by the standards of my actual mortgage and actual food costs was insufficient. I had savings, not as much as I should have had, which is a sentence that could be spoken by approximately 90% of Americans in their 60s, and which reveals something about the structure of the American working life that I no longer have the patience to be diplomatic about. I had savings and I had Social Security at 62, which I took early because I modeled the break-even on delaying, and the conclusion was that I didn't have the cash runway to wait for the larger benefit. Early Social Security at 62 is not full Social Security. It was $920 a month. My rent was $1,400. My health insurance through COBRA, which I was legally entitled to continue for 18 months at the full unsubsidized rate, was $680 a month. $920 minus $1,400 minus $680 is negative $1,160. I'll let you verify that arithmetic yourself. It is correct and it is devastating. I want to be clear about the job search because I know the unspoken accusation that some people watching this are forming, which is that the obvious solution was to keep working. I tried. I sent 47 job applications in the first 6 months after my termination. I know it was 47 because I kept a spreadsheet, which is the reflex of someone who spent 34 years managing complex systems. I applied to logistics coordinator positions, supply chain analyst roles, operations management jobs at 3 different hardware store chains, 2 grocery distribution companies, a furniture manufacturing facility, and a cold storage operator in the Central Valley. The responses sorted themselves into 2 categories. The first was silence, which accounted for 39 of the 47. The second was a form rejection that arrived in less than 24 hours, which tells you that an algorithm evaluated your application and found it insufficient, and which also tells you that a human being did not read it. 2 phone screens, 0 offers. I was 62 years old in a market that had run a calculation and determined that 62 was a cost-benefit analysis that didn't produce a favorable result. I understood the calculation. I had been on the other side of hiring decisions for 11 years, and I understood exactly how those decisions were made. Understanding it didn't make it less humiliating. Being told, even indirectly, even by an automated process, that what you spent 34 years becoming is not worth the cost of employing, you carries a specific weight that doesn't dissipate just because you can explain the economics of it. The cold coffee and the piece of paper were on a Tuesday. The following Sunday, my daughter, Rachel, who lives in Portland, and who calls every Sunday with the consistency of someone who means what she says when she says she'll do something, called. I told her the math, all of it, the numbers, the timeline, the destination the numbers were describing. Rachel is 37 and works in public health policy and has a way of listening that involves genuine silence rather than the performance of listening while formulating a response. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad, have you ever thought about whether you have to do the math in California?" I didn't understand the question immediately. She clarified, "You spent 34 years managing logistics, finding efficiencies in broken systems. What's the most inefficient variable in your current system?" I sat on the phone with my daughter and thought about it with the same attention I'd given to supply chain problems for 3 decades. And I said, "The rent." And she said, "Well, so what happens if the rent is somewhere else?" I said, "I didn't know what you meant by somewhere else." She said, "Somewhere that isn't Fresno, California, somewhere the number is different." I told her I'd never thought about living outside the country. She said, "That's probably why you haven't done it." She said it gently. It was still a correct observation. I want to describe the research process because I know that people watching this either have done it themselves and want to compare notes, or are at the beginning of it and want to understand how it works. I started from 0. I was not someone who had international living on my mental horizon. International, for me, had meant driving to Tahoe, and once in my 40s a package vacation to Cancun that I have not thought about since. I searched countries to retire in on low income and followed the logic of the results rather than the assumption of the results. I watched videos, I joined forums, I read threads on expat boards with the methodical patience of someone who managed supply chain documentation for 34 years and who understands that the useful information is usually 3 levels below the surface of any discussion. I started eliminating options. Southeast Asia kept appearing. Within Southeast Asia, Vietnam kept appearing with a specific combination of factors. The cost of living numbers were consistently lower than Thailand and comparable alternatives. The healthcare infrastructure in the cities was described as genuinely adequate rather than aspirationally adequate. The visa situation for long-term foreign residents had workable options. And there was a specific city that kept appearing in discussions, not as a famous destination, but as a place where people actually lived. Dalat, in the Central Highlands, a city at 1,500 meters of elevation, which is nearly 5,000 feet, which means a climate that is cool and dry by the standards of Southeast Asia, which sounded impossible and turned out to be true. 3 weeks of research and the combination of numbers and descriptions kept pointing at Dalat with the consistency that good data has when you're asking the right question. I found the book You Were Never Meant to Stay in one of those expat forums in a thread about the emotional difficulty of deciding to leave, which gets discussed much less than the logistical difficulty, and which is, in fact, the harder problem. I had solved the logistics, or was in the process of solving them. The logistics of a long-distance move are complex, but they are solvable with research and patience and a spreadsheet. The emotional problem is different. The emotional problem is that I had lived in Fresno for 62 years, and leaving Fresno felt like leaving myself, which is a feeling that doesn't respond to a spreadsheet. It responds to something else. The book was the something else. It asks you to be precise about what is actually holding you, which is a different question from why you haven't left, and which produces a different kind of answer. When I was precise about what was actually holding me in Fresno, I found that some of it was real, things that were genuinely mine and that would come with me regardless of geography, and some of it was not real in the way I'd assumed. Some of it was the apartment with the parking structure view and the market that moved the rent from $1,100 to $1,400 while I wasn't paying attention. Some of it was the address, and the address was not, when I examined it with precision, actually me. I read the book in 3 evenings at the kitchen table with the math paper still on it, and put it down after the last page, and sat for a while. The link is in the description below. I'd send it to anyone doing the version of math I was doing. My son Michael was the one who made the plane ticket feel real. Michael is 34, lives in Sacramento, has 2 children that I am extremely fond of and see less than I'd like, which is true of grandchildren at any distance. I drove to Sacramento on a Saturday in October to tell him in person about Dalat, because I am from a generation that believes important news should be delivered face to face, not because anything about the medium changes the content, but because the presence is part of the respect. I told him everything. The full version with the spreadsheet and the forum research and the healthcare numbers and the visa options and the cost breakdown. Michael listened with his mother's expression, which is the expression of someone taking in information rather than preparing a rebuttal. When I finished, he said, "Dad, what's the version of this where you stay in Fresno and it works?" I said there wasn't one. Not without liquidating the retirement savings on a timeline that ended in broke. He said, "Then what are you waiting for?" What are you waiting for? 34 years of logistics management, and the most useful question anyone asked me was 4 words, and none of them was complicated. I drove back to Fresno and booked a flight. The most important practical decision I made was going to Dalat for 6 weeks on a tourist visa before committing to the logistics of a permanent move. I want to emphasize this because I've talked to people who watch videos like this one and want to move on the basis of the video, which is the wrong order of operations. A video is evidence of someone else's experience. 6 weeks of living somewhere is evidence of yours. the tourist experience and the residential experience of a place differ in ways you cannot predict from the outside. You need to be inside before you know. Dalat in person differed from Dalat in the research in two important ways. The first was the climate. I had read that Dalat was cool by the standards of Southeast Asia. Reading that and standing in Dalat in the morning when the air comes down from the mountains are two different kinds of knowing. The Langbian mountain range sits above the city, and the air that moves down from it in the morning is the kind of air that makes you stop and breathe deliberately, the way you breathe when something is worth noticing. It is genuinely cool like a California morning in October, not cool like air conditioning. It was the first time I had been in Southeast Asia and not been immediately hot. The second way Dalat differed from the research was the food. I had read that the markets were excellent. The markets in Dalat are not just excellent, they are organized around a principle of freshness that I didn't have a frame of reference for. I think the strawberries, for which the city is famous, are grown in the highlands within 30 kilometers of the market, and they taste like what a strawberry is supposed to taste like before industrial agriculture decided that shelf life mattered more than flavor. The artichokes, which grow here because of the altitude and the soil, are sold by the dozen at prices I initially assumed were per artichoke and were per dozen. The coffee, grown in the hills surrounding the city, is sold in varieties and roast levels at the market in the same way that a wine region sells its local production, with genuine distinctions between farms and processing methods, and it costs a fraction of what specialty coffee costs in California. I ate at local restaurants every day of the 6 weeks, full meals for between $2 and $5. I ate well, significantly better than I ate in Fresno on 4 times the budget. The numbers, which are the foundation of everything, and which I will give you with full precision, because you deserve that. Monthly income, Social Security, $920. A small monthly distribution from my retirement accounts that I now manage carefully since the crisis has passed. Approximately $300 per month. Total available, $1,220 per month. This is my real number. I am not a man with a pension or an inheritance or any income source beyond what I've described. $1,220 a month is what I have and what I live on comfortably. Housing. I rent a house, not a room in a house, not an apartment, a house. 2 bedrooms with good ventilation, 1 full bathroom and 1 half bath. A kitchen that opens to a covered terrace where I eat breakfast every morning, a garden of approximately 200 square meters attached to the back of the property where I now grow tomatoes, herbs, chilies, and the highland strawberries that are native to this region and that I have learned to cultivate through a combination of reading and the sustained instruction of my neighbor Min, who has grown them for 30 years and who has the patience of someone who understands that teaching takes time. The house is located in a residential neighborhood on the eastern side of the city, quiet streets, 15 minutes by motorbike from the central market, 5 minutes walk from a small local market that opens 6 days a week and where I buy most of my produce. My rent for this house is $250 per month. I want you to read that again. $250 per month for a 2-bedroom house with a garden and a covered terrace in a UNESCO-recognized highland city in Vietnam. My rent in Fresno was $1,400 for a 2-bedroom apartment with a view of a parking structure, utilities, electricity, which I use conservatively because the climate eliminates the need for air conditioning, and I have learned to time the washing machine for non-peak hours, comes to $25 per month. Water, $6. Internet service, which is fast and reliable enough that I video call Michael and Rachel in high definition without buffering, $18. Phone with local SIM card and data, $10. Total housing and utilities combined, $309 per month. Healthcare. This is the section that will matter most to people watching this from the United States and who have experienced American healthcare costs as the background radiation of financial anxiety. I carry private health insurance designed for foreign residents in Vietnam. The policy costs $75 per month and provides coverage for hospitalization, major medical procedures, and specialist referrals at international standard private hospitals. For routine care, I use a clinic 3 blocks from my house, where an appointment with an English-speaking physician costs $12, not $12 after insurance, $12 total. I pay it in cash and walk out having seen a doctor who took my full history and answered my questions without a waiting room delay beyond 20 minutes. My blood pressure medication, for which I have taken a prescription since I was 58 years old and which was costing me $90 per month in California through my insurance plan with the copay, costs $11 per month here at the pharmacy at the end of my street for the identical medication at the identical dosage. I want to be very precise about that number. $90 per month in Fresno, $11 per month in Dalat. Same drug, same milligrams. I've had 2 complete medical checkups since arriving in Vietnam, each including a full blood panel, an EKG, a chest x-ray, and a consultation with a physician who reviewed everything in detail. Each checkup cost approximately $60, including all tests and the consultation. In California, with insurance, my annual physical produced an explanation of benefits that suggested the retail cost of an equivalent workup was somewhere north of $800. Total monthly health spending, including the insurance premium, all medications, and routine care, approximately $110 per month. Food. I eat better than I have at any other point in my adult life, and I am saying this as a precise statement rather than a rhetorical flourish. I shop at the Central Market 3 times per week. I buy what is in season, which in Dalat is always something worth buying. I cook at home most mornings and evenings and eat out 2 or 3 times per week at local restaurants where a complete meal costs between $3 and $6. My monthly food budget is approximately $160. Transportation. I own a used motorbike that I purchased for $320 shortly after arriving and which is now fully paid and does not appear in my monthly expenses. Monthly fuel, $8. Maintenance, negligible. Everything else, meaning haircuts at $2, an occasional beer at $1.50, the once monthly dinner at the French restaurant in the city center that charges $15 for a full dinner with wine, and which remains one of the more improbable things I have encountered in a highland city in Vietnam. Approximately $120 per month. Grand total of all monthly expenses, $757. Monthly income, $1,220. Monthly surplus, $463. every month. Not occasionally, not in the good months, every month. I put 300 of it back into savings, the savings that were on a trajectory towards zero. The trajectory reversed. I think about that phrase sometimes when I am in the garden at 7 in the morning with the strawberries coming in and the coffee finished and the mountain visible through the last of the morning fog and nothing immediately required. The trajectory reversed. Let me tell you about the garden because the garden is not a footnote. In Fresno, I had a balcony with a succulent that I watered with inconsistency. Before the apartment, when Helen and I had the house, we had a lawn that we paid a service to maintain because we were both working full schedules, and a lawn requires attention that full schedules don't leave room for. I had not grown anything intentionally since I was 10 years old, and my mother had a Roma tomato plant on the back porch of our house in Fresno, and assigned me watering duty as a form of responsibility building. I approached the garden at the Dalat house as someone who knew the general theory of plants without any practical experience, which is not a strong starting position. The landlady, Lynn, showed me the garden when I viewed the house and told me I could do whatever I wanted with it. She said this with the particular casualness of someone who has rented property for a long time and learned that tenants are unpredictable. I started with tomatoes because they were familiar in shape and I had vague memories of my mother's plant. My neighbor Min, a retired school teacher of 68, who has the garden on the other side of our shared low fence that I can only describe as an ongoing masterwork of Vietnamese highland cultivation, appeared at the fence in the second week and watched me install my irrigation spacing in silence for several minutes before coming through the gate without asking and correcting it. He then stayed for an hour and showed me things about this specific soil, this specific elevation, this specific microclimate that I did not know I needed to know, and that have since made the difference between a garden that produces and a garden that struggles. He speaks no English. I now speak enough Vietnamese to conduct a basic conversation on familiar topics, of which garden technique has become one. We work side by side several times a week on our respective sides of the fence, in the companionable silence of people who share an interest without requiring language to share it. The tomatoes are productive. The strawberries, which I planted on Min's recommendation, have become something I look forward to every morning. The chilies, which I seeded from a variety I found at the market on his suggestion, have exceeded my heat tolerance estimates significantly and produced several dinners that were memorable for reasons beyond flavor. I have learned to use them sparingly. Min finds this amusing in a way that does not require words. I want to tell you the difficult parts, because the only version of this story worth your time is the honest version, and the honest version includes the things that required adjustment. Navigating Dalat traffic on a motorbike is a skill that takes time to acquire, and the acquisition period involves several close calls that you understand retrospectively to have been educational. The traffic in the late afternoon on the central arteries moves with a logic that differs from California traffic, and that rewards patience and attentiveness rather than the speed-based decision-making that American driving instills. I adapted. It took about 2 months to feel genuinely comfortable, and another 2 before I stopped thinking about it consciously, and it became reflex. The language is the more persistent challenge. Vietnamese is tonal, meaning a single syllable can mean 6 different things depending on pitch, and my ear for tonal distinctions was not developed when I arrived. My early attempts at the market produced results that ranged from kind correction to gentle confusion. I have improved substantially. I am not fluent. I am functional in the context that matter for daily life, which is sufficient for the life I'm living. I can navigate the market, the clinic, the motorbike repair shop, the government office, and a basic social conversation with my neighbors. For anything more complex, I use a translation application that has been patient with me in a way that inanimate software is not usually credited with. The long-term visa bureaucracy was its own education. An issue with one document in the residency application process required 11 weeks, 4 trips, and 3 different government offices to resolve. I approached it the way I approach supply chain disruptions, which is methodically and without catastrophe, and with the understanding that bureaucratic friction is friction rather than obstruction, and that friction yields eventually to consistent applied pressure. It resolved. The house with the garden was worth 11 weeks of document navigation. Rachel came to visit in November, her first time in Southeast Asia, her first time anywhere in the region. She landed in Ho Chi Minh City, flew up to Dalat, arrived at my house at 7 in the morning with the particular alertness of someone who has not slept on a long flight and has been awake long enough that sleep no longer seems like an option. I made coffee from beans I had bought 3 days earlier from a small farm cooperative 20 kilometers outside the city, beans that I had ground that morning in a hand grinder that produces a consistency I have not been able to replicate with any electric grinder I've owned. I made it the way Min showed me, but as Vietnamese coffee is made when you are making it for someone worth the attention, which is a slow paper filter that takes 6 minutes and produces a cup that has nothing in common with what passes for coffee in most American contexts. I handed it to Rachel on the terrace. She drank it without speaking, looked at the garden where the strawberries were showing their morning color, looked at the Lang Bian mountain visible above the tree line, and said, "Dad, you actually figured it out." Yes, I did. It took 62 years and a piece of paper with patient numbers on a kitchen table in Fresno, and a daughter who asked the question with the right framing, and a book that separated the real from the imagined, and a flight, and a motorbike, and a neighbor who fixed my irrigation spacing without being asked. But I figured it out. And if you are sitting somewhere right now with a version of the math paper that I had on my kitchen table, if the numbers are telling you something clear and patient that you've been arguing with, I want to tell you that the paper is not the conclusion. It's the prompt. It's telling you that a variable needs to change. Sometimes the variable is the rent. Sometimes the rent is somewhere else. And the book, You Were Never Meant to Stay, is the thing that helps you separate what's actually you from what's just the address. Link is below. The trajectory can reverse. The garden is producing. The coffee is ready at 7. The mountain is there when the fog clears. Come find the market on Saturday.